So you worked at Zenefits during all the crazy growth. And so from my understanding, you joined Zenefits as an SDR. And then 2 years later, you were running a team of about 200 SDRs. I'd love to start today's conversation with this growth story. And maybe a good place to start is like, how were you so successful as an SDR in the early days of Zenefits? And then how did you sort of transition into management so quickly?
Yeah, it's a fun story to think back on. And I think just a different time in tech altogether. I don't know if we'll see like another story like this one again, certainly at least anytime soon, because I think there were lessons that were learned along the way. But I guess to kind of tell the story, it was my second SDR gig, first one out of college. And then I worked for a company that folded up shop that, I was performing well at, found out, hey, we're not going to be doing this thing anymore. I'm like, okay. So I took a gig at Zenefits as an SDR, and I've been doing, SDR and kind of like SMB AE sales for about a year and a half. So I knew what I was doing. And so a bit of a step back to take 2 steps forward. And I think that, there's a lot of like advice in Silicon Valley that's shared about like how to pick a company. And a lot of it, like to summarize kind of some of the things that I've learned over the years, it's like more about the name on the front of the jersey and like the growth of the company and the sort of like scale that you can experience during your time there, and the opportunity to grow. And Zenefits like had all those characteristics. To be honest, I didn't even know that at the time. I got lucky in that way, and I got to work with people that believed in me and work in an environment where I could really like show up, do something I knew how to do, and perform at a high level. I remember probably like 7 or 8 months in, when I'd sort of stood out as one of the higher performers on the team, we were making a decision to expand outside of just the SF Bay Area, as we were like raised a couple rounds of funding, and it was sort of like time to grow. And I got asked the question if I wanted to go open up an office in Scottsdale, Arizona, which I understand, Alex, you've got some experience with, and we can touch on that one later. And I remember talking to Parker, our CEO, Parker Conrad, and he used the analogy. He's like, Robby, like, maybe once or twice in your career, a giant like tsunami surf wave will come crashing towards you. You're the one holding the surfboard. You get to decide, like, are you going to jump on or not? And I like, by the end of the conversation, I had already bought a plane ticket to Scottsdale. I was like so fired up. I was ready to run through a wall. So that was kind of one of those, I don't know, Silicon Valley indoctrination moments for me. So I moved out there, and, over the course, like you said, of 2 years, we hired 250 SDRs and built a management layer of 25 managers and a couple directors. And, I think candidly, like, there were aspects of that model that worked really well up to a point. And then like at a certain point, we were cutting the size of the pie, like smaller for a larger group of people. And I think that, there were a lot of lessons along the way that I'm happy to talk about. But looking back on it, it's almost like crazy to kind of like say those numbers out loud and think about how many interviews and how many like onboarding sessions we were conducting to bring that many people together to sort of like conduct, this mission as a team in such a short, like compressed period of time. It really felt like getting a kind of a startup MBA in a really compressed timeline.
Yeah, Parker is just such an inspirational leader, and the way he can just talk and fire people up. I've heard so many stories about Zenefits, and the few times I've been lucky enough to speak with him, it's just like, wow. It's like, okay, I aspire to be like him as a CEO, and sort of that leadership ability and the ability to inspire people. It's just like, it's so amazing. I love that tsunami story. That sounds like very much a Parker analogy. What did outbound look like at the time? Like, I know Matt Epstein was sending a lot of emails out kind of from the marketing side of things, but was he managing SDRs too? And were you doing like a lot of personalized outreach, or kind of how were you able to be so successful at outbound?
Yeah, we at the time that I joined, we were actually like all in entirely an inbound shop. So Matt is like a mad scientist of demand gen and marketing broadly. Like he's, as a CMO, he's got a lot of skills, but at the time at Zenefits, like his core focus was really like demand generation, running campaigns, and it was incredibly effective at it. I've actually never seen anybody in my career since then as effective as Matt. And he's done it again, now at Rippling. And, I think at the time, Zenefits was really inbound driven in the early days. At first it was kind of like YC referrals, and then it was like the next cut of like that network, and then so on and so forth. It was around the time that we raised our Series B that it became clear that like moving from sort of like lower like SMB mid-market sort of up to upper mid-market and enterprise was just like an initiative that we wanted to take on as a business, as we thought about total addressable market and customer lifetime value and all that. And that was where the outbound effort started. Was they're just, the same message of like, free HR software, wasn't really resonating with companies of sort of a certain size, and it had to be more of like a value message. So that's where the outbound play came in, and it worked. Like pretty much straight away, we were landing that message and converting, a high number of opportunities per rep, and we're able to scale that, I think, like pretty effectively all the way to like 100 SDRs over the course of a couple of years. We started to see diminishing returns around like 150 or so, is kind of on that journey to 250. So yeah, it was the biggest outbound team I've ever experienced in my career, and kind of quite a sight to behold, just like behind the scenes of all the operations that have to take place to support and feed sort of like that many mouths in terms of like the scale that we were reaching.
Yeah, I'd love to like kind of go behind the scenes of how you were able to just hire that many humans. And I think it was under 2 years, you hired like 250 sales reps, 25 managers. Like, were you just in interviews all day? Did you do training classes? Like what did that like kind of program look like?
Yeah, I mean, all the above. I think, it was very intentional when I moved out there, that like the mission was to sort of grow a very large inside sales team and a very compressed timeline. So I went there eyes wide open. It was one of those things where I'd never done that before. So it was hard to know exactly how it was going to go and what to expect. But, if you kind of do the math on what does it take to hire 250 people, well, you got to do, at least a couple thousand interviews. If you think about maybe a 20-30% conversion rate of candidates, and, the phone screens and all that go above it. So we had, at the height of it, there were like dedicated days of the week at one point in time, all day Tuesday and Thursday from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. were just like consecutive in-person interviews. And we had a recruiting team that was like orchestrating like quite a bit of, outbound sort of recruiting efforts. We were on campus at universities in Arizona recruiting people. We were moving people into the state for fairly like entry-level positions. I mean, it was a fully orchestrated, almost go-to-market motion on the recruiting side in and of itself. And then like as we kind of got folks onboarded, it was really, we took sort of like a college kind of introduction type of approach, where we actually had, I remember in the office, like a big stadium seating kind of like lecture hall format. And there were like, maybe 100 seats. And so there'd be people in there. We stood up an enablement program pretty quickly that really focused on those first couple of weeks. And, I think the goal was to get people onto the phone as quickly as possible. You worked at Yelp. We actually modeled a lot of what we did on the Yelp program. And I understand that you went through that program yourself.
Yeah, no, it sounds very similar. I mean, I think I showed up at Yelp with like 35 other people, and I didn't even know what sales actually was, and then you get put into like this training program, and then, day 2, you're on the phones and you're just getting thrown into the fire. And then I think by the time I left Yelp a year later, only like 7 or 6 of the people were still in the training class, right? It was such a churn and burn sort of program, but like, you learned a lot very quickly. And it was, I don't know, quite the experience. It gave me some street cred later on when I was at Lattice, and I was like, I could talk to SDRs and be like, I used to do this too. Even though I was sitting in the marketing seat then.